May 26, 1940. Captain William Tennant stood on the beach at Dunkirk, watching thousands of British and French soldiers crowd the sand, while German artillery shells whistled overhead and black smoke from burning oil tanks darkened the sky. The situation appeared hopeless. The British Expeditionary Force and French First Army were trapped against the sea with their backs to the English Channel. German panzers had cut them off from retreat. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Royal Navy destroyers attempting evacuations were being sunk by dive bombers. Military planners estimated that perhaps 30,000 soldiers might be rescued before the pocket collapsed, and hundreds of thousands would be captured or killed. Yet over the next 9 days, an improvised fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats would evacuate over 338,000 Allied soldiers in what became one of the most extraordinary rescues in military history. The Dunkirk evacuation transformed military disaster into symbolic victory and allowed Britain to continue fighting when defeat seemed certain. The road to Dunkirk began on May 10, 1940, when Germany launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. German forces had been preparing for months to execute a daring plan that would avoid the mistakes of World War I. Rather than attacking through Belgium, as the Allies expected, the main German thrust would come through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and Luxembourg, an area the French considered impassable for tanks. General Erich von Manstein had developed this plan specifically to catch Allied forces out of position. The German attack used 3 army groups. Army Group B under General Fedor von Bock would invade the Netherlands and northern Belgium, drawing Allied attention northward. Army Group A under General Gerd von Rundstedt would deliver the main blow through the Ardennes with 7 panzer divisions concentrated in a narrow front. Army Group C under General Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb would pin French forces along the Maginot Line. The plan was bold and risky. If the Ardennes thrust failed, or if Allied forces reacted quickly enough to contain it, the entire German army would be trapped in a vulnerable salient. The invasion began at dawn on May 10th, with German forces crossing into Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg simultaneously. Luftwaffe bombers struck Allied airfields, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground. German paratroopers seized key bridges and fortifications. The speed and coordination of the attack shocked Allied commanders who had expected weeks of warning before any German offensive. The British Expeditionary Force and French First Army immediately moved north into Belgium, according to pre-arranged plans. Allied commanders believed they were advancing to meet the main German attack, and that they would establish defensive lines along Belgian rivers as planned. They were walking into a trap. While Allied attention focused on Belgium, German panzers were racing through the Ardennes toward the Meuse River. The German advance through the Ardennes proceeded faster than even German planners had expected. The forest roads were difficult and caused massive traffic jams as thousands of vehicles tried to move through narrow passages. However, French reconnaissance failed to detect the massive German concentration until it was too late. On May 13th, German forces reached the Meuse River at Sedan and immediately began crossing. French defenses along the river were weak, manned primarily by reserve divisions with inadequate anti-tank weapons. Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers attacked French positions continuously, while German infantry established bridgeheads. By May 14th, German engineers had built bridges capable of carrying tanks, and the panzer divisions began flooding across the Meuse. The French counterattacked, but could not contain the breakthrough. German tanks raced westward toward the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. General Heinz Guderian commanded 19th Panzer Corps, leading the German advance. Guderian was one of Germany's foremost advocates of armored warfare and had developed many of the tactics the Wehrmacht used. He pushed his divisions forward relentlessly, despite concerns from superiors that he was advancing too quickly and exposing his flanks. Guderian understood that speed was essential. If German forces could reach the channel before Allied forces could react, they would trap the entire BEF and the best French divisions in a pocket. Guderian's tanks covered ground at rates that shocked both German and Allied commanders. His forces moved 60 miles in 2 days, far faster than infantry could follow. French attempts to counterattack German flanks failed because French armored divisions were dispersed in small groups, supporting infantry, rather than concentrated for decisive action. By May 20th, German panzers reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, cutting off all Allied forces north of the breakthrough. The British Expeditionary Force, French First Army, and Belgian Army were now trapped in a shrinking pocket with their backs to the sea. German forces were closing from south, east, and northeast. The Belgian Army was near collapse. French forces were disorganized and running low on supplies. The BEF was intact and capable of fighting, but had no secure supply lines. British commanders faced impossible choices. Should they attack southward, trying to break through German lines and rejoin French forces? Should they defend positions and hope for French counterattack to relieve them? Or should they attempt evacuation by sea, abandoning most equipment and leaving French and Belgian allies? Lord Gort commanded the British Expeditionary Force. Gort recognized that the situation was desperate and that conventional military solutions were not viable. French commanders urged coordinated counterattacks to restore the front, but Gort believed such attacks would fail and would exhaust British forces before they could reach the coast. On May 19th, Gort made the critical decision to begin withdrawing toward Channel ports, even though this meant abandoning plans to coordinate with French forces. Gort's decision was controversial, and French commanders felt betrayed by British withdrawal. However, Gort's realistic assessment saved the BEF. If British forces had remained inland attempting counterattacks as French commanders desired, they would have been destroyed. British forces withdrew toward Dunkirk, the only Channel port still in Allied hands. Calais and Boulogne had already fallen to German forces. The perimeter around Dunkirk was approximately 60 miles long, extending from Gravelines on the coast through inland villages to Nieuwpoort on the Belgian coast. British and French forces established defensive lines along canals and in fortified villages. They had to hold long enough to evacuate as many soldiers as possible. German forces began attacking the perimeter from multiple directions. Luftwaffe bombers struck Dunkirk port and the beaches. German artillery began ranging the evacuation sites. The situation appeared hopeless. The port facilities at Dunkirk were burning. The beaches were crowded with soldiers, but few ships could reach them. The Royal Navy estimated it might evacuate perhaps 30,000 soldiers before German forces overran the perimeter. The British War Cabinet met continuously debating what to do. Some ministers argued for negotiating with Germany, since military defeat appeared inevitable. Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to consider surrender. Churchill had become Prime Minister on May 10th, the same day Germany invaded. His government was only 2 weeks old and already faced the greatest crisis in British history. Churchill told the War Cabinet that Britain would fight on, regardless of what happened at Dunkirk. He authorized Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the BEF from Dunkirk, on May 26th. The operation was named after the Dynamo Room in Dover Castle, where Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay established his headquarters to coordinate the evacuation. Ramsay faced enormous challenges. He needed ships to carry hundreds of thousands of soldiers from France to England. He needed those ships to operate under air attack. He needed to organize embarkation procedures on beaches and at damaged port facilities. Most critically, he needed time. Captain William Tennant was appointed senior naval officer at Dunkirk, responsible for organizing evacuation operations on shore. Tennant arrived on May 27th to find chaos. Thousands of soldiers crowded the beaches, but few boats could reach them. The harbor was partially blocked by sunken ships and was under continuous air attack. Large ships could not approach the beaches because the water was too shallow. Soldiers wading out to boats in deep water risked drowning. Tennant made a critical decision. He noticed the East Mole, a wooden breakwater extending over a mile into the sea, was still intact despite bombing. The East Mole was designed as a breakwater, not a pier, and was not built to accommodate ships. However, Tennant realized that destroyers could come alongside the mole and embark soldiers directly rather than using small boats to ferry soldiers from beaches. He ordered soldiers directed to the East Mole and called for destroyers to attempt berthing there. The East Mole became the primary evacuation point. Over the next week, more than 200,000 soldiers would embark from the East Mole. The RAF provided fighter cover over Dunkirk, operating from bases in southeastern England. However, RAF fighters were operating at extreme range and could only remain over Dunkirk for short periods before needing to return to refuel. The Luftwaffe had bases in France much closer to Dunkirk and could maintain continuous presence. German bombers attacked shipping and the beaches repeatedly. Stuka dive bombers were particularly effective, attacking with sirens howling to terrorize soldiers. RAF Spitfire and Hurricane fighters shot down many German aircraft, but could not prevent all attacks. Soldiers on beaches often did not see RAF fighters and believed the RAF was not protecting them. This created lasting resentment between soldiers and airmen, despite RAF losses being heavy. The RAF lost over 100 aircraft during the Dunkirk operation. On May 28th, the situation worsened when Belgium surrendered. King Leopold ordered Belgian forces to cease fighting, effective May 28th at 4 a.m. This surrender opened a gap in the northern part of the perimeter. German forces immediately pushed toward Dunkirk from the northeast, threatening to collapse the entire pocket. British and French forces had to rapidly redeploy to plug the gap left by Belgian withdrawal. Fighting became intense along the canal lines as German infantry and tanks tried to break through. British and French soldiers fought desperate rearguard actions, buying time for evacuation. Many defensive positions became surrounded and fought to the last man, or until ammunition ran out. The Royal Navy assembled every available destroyer for Dunkirk operations. Destroyers could carry up to 900 soldiers and make the Channel crossing in about 3 hours. However, destroyers were vulnerable to air attack. On May 29th, German dive bombers sank 3 destroyers and damaged 7 others. Naval commanders realized they could not continue accepting such losses. The Admiralty reluctantly decided to withdraw modern destroyers from daytime operations and use them only at night when air attack risk was reduced. This meant daytime evacuation would depend on smaller vessels that could not carry as many soldiers. The small vessels pool was established to gather civilian boats capable of making the Channel crossing. The Admiralty sent out calls for any boat owners with craft suitable for sea voyage to register. Hundreds of civilians responded. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, lifeboats, tugboats, barges, and ferries gathered at ports along the English coast. Many were commandeered by the Navy and crewed by naval personnel. Others were sailed by civilian volunteers who crossed the Channel despite the danger. These became the famous little ships of Dunkirk. The smallest were barely 20 feet long. The largest were Channel ferries and cargo ships. All contributed to the evacuation. The little ships could approach beaches where larger vessels could not reach and could ferry soldiers from shore to larger ships waiting in deeper water. Charles Littler was the senior surviving officer from the Titanic disaster in 1912. Now 66 years old and retired, Lightoller took his motor yacht Sundowner across the Channel to Dunkirk. Lightoller made multiple trips, ferrying soldiers from beaches to larger ships. On one trip, Sundowner carried 130 soldiers, despite being designed for 21 people. The vessel was so overloaded that water came within inches of the gunwales. Other civilian sailors showed similar courage. Many had never navigated in combat conditions or under air attack. Some boats were sunk by bombs or artillery. Some ran aground or collided with other vessels in the crowded waters. The civilian contribution was vital. Without the little ships, evacuation numbers would have been far lower. Soldiers waiting on beaches faced terrifying conditions. German artillery and aircraft attacked constantly. Soldiers had no cover on open sand. They organized themselves into lines extending into the water, hoping to board boats more quickly. Some waited for days with minimal food or water. Discipline generally held despite the stress. Officers maintained order and prevented panic. However, the sight of bombs falling among crowded soldiers and ships burning offshore tested everyone's courage. Many soldiers waded out to boats, only to have the boats fill before they could board. They waded back to shore and waited for the next boat. Some drowned when overloaded boats capsized. Bodies floated in the surf. The Luftwaffe intensified attacks on May 30th and 31st. Clear weather allowed German bombers to operate continuously. Several ships were sunk in Dunkirk harbor, creating obstacles. The town of Dunkirk was burning. Oil storage tanks had been hit, and black smoke covered the area, making visibility difficult. German artillery now had the range to hit the beaches and the East Mole. Shells fell among soldiers waiting to embark. Despite the attacks, evacuation numbers increased. By the end of May 31st, over 132,000 soldiers had been evacuated. This was far more than anyone had thought possible. However, hundreds of thousands remained, and the perimeter was shrinking. French forces held the southern and western portions of the perimeter, fighting fierce defensive battles. The French First Army had been cut off from main French forces and was now effectively under British command for evacuation purposes. However, French soldiers felt they were being given lower priority for evacuation than British soldiers. Initially, the British did prioritize evacuating the BEF, with the intention that once British forces were evacuated, French forces would follow. This created tension between the Allies. Churchill personally intervened, ordering that French and British soldiers should be evacuated in equal numbers. This decision was militarily questionable, since it meant the BEF would take longer to evacuate, but was politically essential to maintain the alliance. The Dunkirk perimeter continued to shrink. By June 1st, Allied forces held only a narrow strip along the coast, a few miles deep. German artillery could reach almost all evacuation points. The RAF made maximum effort on June 1st, flying continuous patrols and engaging in major dogfights over the beaches. This was the heaviest day of air combat during the evacuation. RAF fighters shot down many German aircraft, forcing the Luftwaffe to reduce bombing intensity. However, RAF losses were also heavy. The air battle over Dunkirk cost the Luftwaffe the momentum it needed to destroy evacuation operations. German ground forces attacked the perimeter from all sides. The town of Dunkirk itself became a battleground with street fighting in ruined buildings. French forces defending Lille, southeast of Dunkirk, held out for days, despite being completely surrounded, tying down 7 German divisions that would otherwise have attacked Dunkirk. The defense of Lille was one of the great sacrifices of the campaign. The French garrison surrendered on June 1st, having exhausted all ammunition and having suffered enormous casualties. Their resistance gave critical days for evacuation. On June 2nd, British forces completed their evacuation. The last British combat units embarked from the East Mole. Only French rearguards remained defending the perimeter. Approximately 40,000 French soldiers still needed evacuation. The final night of evacuation was June 3rd to 4th. Royal Navy destroyers and other vessels made final runs to Dunkirk. French soldiers filed onto ships under continuous artillery fire. The last ship left Dunkirk in the early morning of June 4th. Some French soldiers were left behind when German forces overran the perimeter. They became prisoners of war. In total, Operation Dynamo evacuated 338,226 soldiers over 9 days. This included 211,000 British and 127,000 French. The numbers far exceeded anyone's expectations. However, the evacuation was not without tremendous cost. The Royal Navy lost 6 destroyers sunk and 19 damaged. Over 200 other vessels were lost, including many of the little ships. The RAF lost over 140 aircraft. The BEF left behind all its heavy equipment. Over 2,000 artillery pieces, 700 tanks, 20,000 motorcycles, 45,000 motor vehicles, and vast amounts of ammunition and supplies were abandoned. The British Army would need to completely re-equip. Over 11,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the campaign. French losses were even higher, with tens of thousands killed and over 120,000 captured. The German halt order controversy remains one of the most debated decisions of the war. On May 24th, Hitler ordered German panzer divisions to halt their advance toward Dunkirk. The panzers stopped for 2 days before resuming advance on May 26th. Those 2 days were critical. They allowed the BEF to establish defensive lines and begin organizing evacuation. Why Hitler ordered the halt has been debated ever since. Some historians argue Hitler wanted to preserve panzer forces for the coming battle for France. Others suggest Göring convinced Hitler the Luftwaffe could finish the trapped forces. Some believe Hitler hoped Britain might negotiate peace and did not want to humiliate the British by destroying their army. The most likely explanation is that German generals were concerned about overextended panzer divisions and wanted to consolidate before final attack. Whatever the reason, the halt order gave the BEF crucial time to escape. The Dunkirk evacuation had enormous psychological and political impact beyond the military facts. Militarily, it was a defeat. Britain had been driven from the continent. The BEF had lost all heavy equipment. France was on the verge of collapse. However, Churchill successfully framed Dunkirk as a moral victory. In his famous speech to the House of Commons on June 4th, Churchill acknowledged that wars are not won by evacuations, but emphasized that Britain had preserved its army and would fight on. His speech ended with the memorable declaration that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and streets, and would never surrender. This rhetoric transformed disaster into defiance. The British people rallied behind the narrative that Dunkirk showed British courage and determination. The little ships became powerful symbols. The image of civilian sailors risking their lives to rescue soldiers captured public imagination. The little ships represented ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. The participation of civilian vessels allowed the evacuation to be portrayed as a national effort rather than just a military operation. This helped maintain civilian morale during the difficult years ahead. The reality was more complex. Most soldiers were evacuated by Royal Navy vessels, not civilian boats. The organization was primarily military. However, the symbolic importance of the little ships was greater than their actual numerical contribution. For France, Dunkirk marked the beginning of the end. French forces continued fighting after Dunkirk, but France was militarily defeated. On June 5th, Germany launched Fall Rot, the attack on remaining French forces. French resistance collapsed quickly. Paris fell on June 14th. France requested an armistice on June 17th. The armistice was signed on June 22nd in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler deliberately chose the location to humiliate France. The armistice divided France into occupied and unoccupied zones. The French government under Marshal Philippe Pétain collaborated with Germany. Charles de Gaulle fled to Britain and established Free French forces continuing resistance. Britain now stood alone against Germany. The United States remained neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. The British Empire continued fighting, but could not immediately threaten Germany on the continent. Germany controlled territory from Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. Churchill refused. Britain began preparing for invasion. The RAF had to win air superiority to prevent German invasion. The Battle of Britain would begin in July and continue through October. The preservation of the BEF at Dunkirk meant Britain had trained soldiers to defend the country. If the army had been destroyed or captured at Dunkirk, Britain would have been nearly defenseless. The soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk became the core of rebuilt British forces. Many would fight through the entire war in North Africa, Italy, and the return to France in 1944. The evacuation meant experienced officers and NCOs survived to train new units. The institutional knowledge and combat experience preserved at Dunkirk was invaluable. However, the loss of equipment meant British forces would not be combat-ready for months. Britain had to rebuild its army almost from scratch. American supplies became essential. The United States began providing weapons and equipment even before entering the war. The French soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk faced complex situations. Some returned to France before the armistice and were captured when France surrendered. Others joined Free French forces and continued fighting alongside Britain. Some were repatriated to France under the armistice terms. The French evacuation from Dunkirk has been controversial in French historical memory. Some French historians argue Britain prioritized evacuating British soldiers and left French forces to cover the retreat. British historians counter that French and British soldiers were evacuated in roughly equal numbers from June 1st onward. The truth is that early in the evacuation, British forces were prioritized, but Churchill's intervention ensured later phases evacuated French soldiers equally. The Belgian surrender on May 28th has also been controversial. King Leopold chose to surrender rather than flee to Britain to continue resistance. This contrasted with the Dutch government and Norwegian government which fled to Britain. French and British leaders criticized Leopold, harshly suggesting he had betrayed the alliance. Belgian defenders argue Leopold had no choice given the military situation and that he chose to share his soldiers' captivity rather than abandon them. The Belgian army had fought bravely and had suffered heavy losses. The surrender opened the gap in the perimeter, but Belgian forces could not have continued fighting much longer anyway. The Dunkirk evacuation established patterns and lessons that would influence amphibious operations throughout the war. The importance of air superiority was demonstrated clearly. The vulnerability of ships to air attack meant amphibious operations required fighter cover. The value of specialized landing craft was also shown. Most soldiers at Dunkirk had to wade out to boats or be carried by small craft. Later, Allied amphibious operations would use specially designed landing craft that could beach directly and unload soldiers and vehicles. The command and control challenges of managing hundreds of vessels and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were significant. Ramsey's staff developed procedures that would be refined for later operations, including D-Day. The propaganda value of Dunkirk was exploited by both sides. British propaganda emphasized the miraculous rescue and the little ships. German propaganda portrayed Dunkirk as a great victory demonstrating German military superiority. Both narratives contained truth, but were incomplete. The evacuation was remarkable, but was necessitated by military defeat. Germany had won a stunning victory, but had failed to destroy the BEF, which would have been the greatest strategic achievement. Hitler's decision not to press the attack when the BEF was most vulnerable has been considered one of his greatest mistakes. Individual stories from Dunkirk illustrate the human experience behind the statistics. Commander Jack Campbell commanded the destroyer HMS Sabre, which evacuated soldiers from Dunkirk. Sabre made multiple trips despite damage from near misses. On May 31st, Sabre embarked over 500 soldiers from the East Mole. While departing, German dive bombers attacked. Campbell maneuvered violently, avoiding bombs. Soldiers crowded on deck clung to anything they could find as the ship twisted. One bomb landed so close, it lifted Sabre's stern out of the water. Fragments killed several soldiers and wounded many more. Campbell continued to England, delivering the survivors. Sabre returned to Dunkirk the next day. Sub-Lieutenant John Crosby was a naval officer managing embarkation from the beaches. Crosby organized soldiers into lines and coordinated boats picking them up. He remained at his post for 3 days with minimal food or sleep. German aircraft strafed the beaches repeatedly. Crosby saw soldiers killed by machine gun fire and bombs. He saw boats sink and soldiers drown. Despite the horror, Crosby maintained discipline, preventing panic. On June 3rd, Crosby was among the last officers to leave. He embarked on one of the final boats departing as German forces entered the town. Private Fred Carter was an infantry soldier in the BEF who fought in the retreat to Dunkirk. Carter's unit was part of the rearguard defending canal lines. On May 28th, German infantry attacked Carter's position. Fighting was close range with grenades and rifle fire. Carter was wounded by grenade fragments, but continued fighting. When ammunition ran low, his unit withdrew to the next defensive line. Carter reached Dunkirk on May 31st. He waited on the beach for 2 days before embarking from the East Mole. Carter survived the war and lived until 1992. In interviews, he recalled Dunkirk as the most terrifying experience of his life, surpassing even later combat. The French destroyer Bourrasque participated in evacuation operations. On May 30th, Bourrasque embarked 1,200 soldiers, far exceeding the ship's capacity. While returning to England, Bourrasque struck a mine in the Channel. The ship sank rapidly. Hundreds of soldiers drowned, trapped below decks or unable to swim. British ships rescued about 200 survivors. Over 1,000 died. The Bourrasque tragedy was one of the worst single disasters of the evacuation and highlighted the constant danger from mines in the Channel. The town of Dunkirk itself was destroyed. German bombing and artillery fire reduced much of the town to rubble. The harbor was filled with wrecked ships. Buildings burned for days. Civilians who remained in Dunkirk during the battle endured terrifying conditions. Most had evacuated earlier, but several thousand remained. They sheltered in basements while combat raged overhead. After German forces captured Dunkirk, they found a devastated town. Reconstruction would take years. The strategic debate about Dunkirk continues among historians. Some argue the evacuation was Churchill's greatest achievement, demonstrating his refusal to accept defeat. Others argue Gort deserves primary credit for making the difficult decision to withdraw against French wishes. Still others emphasize Ramsay's organizational skills and Tennant's improvisation in making the East Mole work. The truth is that Dunkirk required contributions from all levels, from strategic leadership to tactical execution to individual courage. No single person or decision explains the outcome. The counterfactual questions about Dunkirk are fascinating but unanswerable. What if Hitler had not ordered the halt? Most historians believe German forces could have reached Dunkirk several days earlier before defensive lines were established. The evacuation would have been far more difficult or impossible. What if the Luftwaffe had concentrated attacks on the East Mole rather than dispersing efforts? The wooden structure was vulnerable and might have been destroyed, preventing most embarkations. What if weather had been worse, preventing the little ships from operating? Evacuation numbers would have been much lower. The reality is that Dunkirk succeeded due to a combination of German mistakes, Allied determination, favorable weather at critical moments, and improvisational brilliance. The long-term impact of Dunkirk on the war was profound. The preservation of the BEF meant Britain could continue fighting. If the army had been destroyed, Britain might have been forced to negotiate. Hitler could have turned all German forces against the Soviet Union in 1941 without worrying about a second front. The entire course of the war might have changed. By evacuating the BEF, Britain maintained the possibility of eventually returning to the continent. That return came on D-Day in June 1944, exactly 4 years after Dunkirk. Many veterans of Dunkirk participated in D-Day, having come full circle from evacuation to invasion. The memory of Dunkirk has remained powerful in British culture. The evacuation has been portrayed in films, books, and commemorations. The little ships are preserved as historical artifacts. Several still participate in anniversary celebrations crossing the Channel to Dunkirk. The narrative of snatching victory from defeat resonates in British historical consciousness. Dunkirk is remembered as an example of British resilience and determination in face of overwhelming odds. This memory has political and cultural significance beyond historical accuracy. The medical aspects of the evacuation presented enormous challenges. Thousands of wounded soldiers needed evacuation alongside able-bodied troops. Hospital ships were marked with red crosses, but German aircraft attacked them anyway. The St. Julian was a hospital ship clearly marked, but was bombed and sunk with heavy loss of life. Medical personnel worked continuously, treating wounded under appalling conditions. Field hospitals near the beaches operated without adequate supplies. Surgeons performed operations while bombs fell nearby. Wounded soldiers often waited days for evacuation, lying exposed on beaches. The priority system for evacuation meant that less seriously wounded sometimes embarked before more critical cases because they could walk onto ships. This created moral dilemmas for medical officers who had to decide who would be evacuated and who would be left behind. The psychological impact on evacuated soldiers was severe. Many suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who had experienced continuous combat, retreat, aerial bombardment, and near-death experiences during evacuation returned to England traumatized. Some broke down completely and required psychiatric treatment. Others suppressed their trauma and functioned, but carried psychological scars for life. The British military did not have sophisticated understanding of combat stress in 1940. Soldiers were expected to recover quickly and return to duty. Those who could not were sometimes labeled as cowards or malingerers. Only decades later would the psychological cost of Dunkirk be fully recognized. The naval personnel who conducted evacuation operations displayed extraordinary professionalism. Royal Navy destroyers made multiple trips to Dunkirk despite losses. Crews worked continuously with minimal rest. Engine room personnel operated in extreme heat, maintaining maximum speed. Gunners fired at attacking aircraft with whatever weapons ships carried. Damage control parties fought fires and flooding when ships were hit. Many sailors volunteered for extra trips beyond what orders required. The destroyer HMS Malcolm made 7 round trips evacuating over 6,000 soldiers. The crew was exhausted, but continued operating until ordered to stand down. The logistics of evacuating over 300,000 soldiers strained British port facilities. Soldiers arriving at Dover, Ramsgate, Margate, and other ports had to be fed, given medical attention, and transported inland. Railway systems were overwhelmed. Civilians provided food and tea to arriving soldiers. Local communities opened their homes to exhausted troops. The organization required to move hundreds of thousands of soldiers from ports to camps and bases across Britain was massive. Military police directed traffic. Railway workers ran special trains continuously. Quartermaster units issued new equipment to soldiers who had lost everything. The home front response to Dunkirk was as important as the evacuation itself. The impact on German strategy was significant. Hitler believed he had destroyed Allied capability to threaten Germany. He turned his attention to planning invasion of Britain and later to the Soviet Union. However, the preservation of the BEF meant Britain retained a trained army that could eventually return to the continent. German military intelligence underestimated how quickly Britain could rebuild. By 1941, British forces were conducting offensive operations in North Africa. By 1942, British commandos were raiding the French coast. The failure to destroy the BEF at Dunkirk meant Germany never achieved complete victory in the West. The air battle over Dunkirk provided valuable lessons for both sides. The RAF learned about the effectiveness of coordinated fighter tactics and the importance of radio communication between aircraft. The Luftwaffe learned that its bombers were vulnerable to fighter attack, and that Stuka dive bombers, though effective against ground targets, were too slow and lacked defensive armament against modern fighters. These lessons influenced the Battle of Britain, which began just weeks after Dunkirk. Both air forces adjusted tactics based on Dunkirk experience. The role of communication and intelligence during Dunkirk was critical. British intelligence intercepted German communications, providing warning of attacks. This allowed ships to be routed away from danger areas and fighter cover to be positioned where needed. The Germans also intercepted Allied communications, but could not prevent evacuation. The fog of war was intense, with neither side having complete understanding of the situation. Commanders made decisions based on partial information and changing circumstances. The French perspective on Dunkirk remains complicated. French military historians acknowledge the evacuation's success, but emphasize French sacrifices that made it possible. Over 120,000 French soldiers were evacuated, more than often recognized in British accounts. However, approximately 40,000 French soldiers were captured when the perimeter collapsed. These prisoners spent the rest of the war in German camps. French families felt abandoned by Britain despite Churchill's intervention to ensure equal evacuation. The perception that Britain saved its own army at French expense damaged Anglo-French relations and contributed to tensions in later years. The Belgian surrender decision by King Leopold has been debated for decades. Leopold's defenders argue he had no constitutional authority to leave Belgium and form government in exile. Belgian law required the king to remain with his people. Critics argue Leopold collaborated with Germany by remaining in occupied Belgium. The truth is more complex. Leopold was imprisoned by Germans and had no freedom of action. He refused to cooperate with German authorities but could not actively resist. The Belgian government, in exile in London, condemned Leopold and stripped him of authority. After the war, Leopold was forced to abdicate in 1951 due to collaboration accusations. The Dunkirk period and Belgian surrender remain sensitive topics in Belgian history. The technological aspects of the evacuation showed both capabilities and limitations. Naval vessels used radio communication to coordinate movements, but frequencies were often jammed or disrupted. Navigation in crowded waters with damaged ports and sunken wrecks required skilled seamanship. Ships operated under blackout conditions at night to avoid detection. The little ships generally lacked radio and had to rely on visual signals and shouted instructions. Mine detection was primitive, and many ships struck mines accidentally. The technology available in 1940 was sufficient to conduct the operation, but offered little margin for error. The weather during Dunkirk was crucial and fortunate. The channel can be extremely rough with high winds and waves that would make small boat operations impossible. During the evacuation period, weather was generally favorable with calm seas and moderate winds. There were periods of fog which hindered air attacks but complicated navigation. If the weather had been worse, the little ships could not have operated, and evacuation numbers would have been drastically reduced. The relatively good weather was one of several fortunate circumstances that contributed to success. The evacuation of other ports besides Dunkirk is often forgotten. Operations also occurred at Ostend, Newport, and La Panne on the Belgian coast. These ports handled smaller numbers but were important for evacuating rearguard units. Some soldiers were evacuated directly from beaches between ports using small boats. The Dunkirk operation was actually spread across dozens of miles of coastline. Coordination between different evacuation points was difficult with limited communication. The German perspective on Dunkirk shows interesting divisions. German soldiers on the ground believed they had won a great victory and destroyed Allied forces. German commanders recognized that allowing over 300,000 enemy soldiers to escape was a strategic failure. Hitler oscillated between claiming Dunkirk as a triumph and expressing frustration that the BEF had escaped. German propaganda emphasized the capture of huge quantities of equipment and the humiliation of British retreat. However, German military planners knew the preserved British Army would be a problem in future. The role of the French Navy during Dunkirk has been understudied. French destroyers and smaller vessels participated actively in evacuation. French sailors showed the same courage as their British counterparts. French destroyer Barrasque sank after hitting a mine with over 1,000 soldiers aboard, the worst single disaster of the operation. Other French vessels made multiple trips despite losses. The French Navy continued fighting after France's defeat in June, with some forces joining Free French and others remaining under Vichy control. The lessons of Dunkirk influenced military doctrine for decades. The importance of maintaining retreat routes was emphasized in training. The vulnerability of ground forces without air superiority was demonstrated clearly. The value of improvisation and junior officer initiative was shown. Military planners studied Dunkirk to understand how to conduct evacuations under fire. These lessons were applied in later operations throughout the war. The personal accounts from Dunkirk survivors reveal the human dimension of the evacuation. Soldiers described the constant fear of air attack, the exhaustion of days without sleep, the hunger when rations ran out, and the overwhelming relief when finally aboard a ship heading for England. Many survivors maintained friendships formed during the ordeal. Veteran organizations kept the memory alive through reunions and commemorations. As survivors aged and died, their testimony became historical record, preserving eyewitness accounts for future generations. The Dunkirk evacuation stands as one of the pivotal moments of World War II. What began as military disaster transformed into symbolic victory through improvisation, courage, and determination. Over 338,000 soldiers were saved to fight another day. Britain preserved its army and maintained the will to resist. The miracle of Dunkirk was not divine intervention, but human achievement under impossible circumstances. The memory ensures that even in darkest defeat, hope and courage can prevail.